Hi, I'm Tim Tyler, and this is a video about biological monopolies. My interest in the topic of monopolies in biology originally arose as a result of my interest in very large-scale cooperative structures. Though it's not obvious from the mechanics of how natural selection works, nature appears to favour cooperation under many circumstances. On this planet, evolution has produced progressively larger and more sophisticated cooperative structures with the passage of time, and today we can clearly see cooperation emerging on a planetary scale. It's been theorised that in the future this trend towards being nice to your fellows might culminate in a type of universal cooperation within which evolution is self-directed by intelligent agents, resulting in competition and other unconscious forms of natural selection between agents playing a minimal role. To better explore this possibility, I turned to other areas where reduced competition had been observed, and I started with the field of economics. There's a deep analogy between the evolution of marketplaces and the evolution of living ecosystems in nature. In capitalist marketplaces, companies compete with each other for resources in a manner which closely mimics the competition seen between organisms in nature. However, the forces of competition in marketplaces do sometimes break down. This can happen when a single agent manages to saturate a particular niche, thereby attaining what economists call a niche monopoly. Projecting this concept back onto biology results in the idea of a monopolising species. A species can come to competitively exclude other species from a given niche if its members are sufficiently powerful and invasive. A sexual species that does this on a sufficiently large scale can face competition mainly from other members of its own species. This severely hampers the progressive nature of natural selection by removing most of the variation on which that selection can act. As with monopolies in economic systems, a biological monopoly by a species typically hampers development and progress. For example, if you imagine that the environment suddenly changes in a way that strongly favours rapid motion, then in a diverse ecosystem, a competition might arise between the species whose individuals who have 2 legs, 4 legs and 6 legs, to see which body plan produces the best runners. However, if there is a monopolising species, variation in the number of legs is unlikely to exist in the first place. Selection can't act on non-existent variation, so the overall response of the ecosystem to the environmental change would be muted. In nature, niche monopolies are not very common. Nature lacks a Monopolies and Mergers Commission, but it has other methods for making sure that no one species gets the upper hand. It uses pathogens and predators to do this. If one genotype becomes too widespread, parasites and predators tune into its weaknesses. To give an example, consider the cordyceps family of fungi. A cordyceps fungus kills its host and then uses the resources in the host's dead body to send out airborne spores to complete its life cycle by infecting new hosts. To quote from David Attenborough's Life on Earth series, "But these attacks do have a positive effect on the jungle's diversity, since parasites like these stop any one group of animal from getting the upper hand. The more numerous a species becomes, the more likely it will be to be attacked by its nemesis, a cordyceps fungus." For an example of the effect of reduced predation, consider the birds of paradise. They're an example of evolution in an ecosystem without serious predation. Without this source of natural selection, the birds of paradise evolved in a manner where sexual selection played a much more prominent role, and where the course of evolution was determined largely by female choice. Modern humans are a classic example of a monopolising species. We've wiped out all our competitors. There are no islands remote enough to produce isolation from the rest of the human gene pool, and so there's little chance of speciation and subsequent competition taking place. Humans compete mostly with other humans. It's true that birds and insects eat our crops, but we're mostly on top of that, and such creatures pose us little real threat. A species monopoly that's sustained over an extended period of time is likely to result in what I call a lone twig monoculture. That's represented by a phylogenetic tree where there's an isolated twig, a branch whose nearest relative is relatively distant from it. I'll illustrate that with a diagram. So here's a phylogenetic tree, time goes that way, and here's the root of the tree, the ancestor, and as you can see there's a number of living relatives of the ancestor in modern times. Many of them, if you look up here for example, these individuals are all closely related to each other, so the last common ancestor is relatively recent compared to the current time. However, there are some species for which that's not true. This species here, for example, has no relatives at all, right back to the root of the tree, and it looks as though it's never even attempted to throw off any species. So this is an example of a species that has some staying power, but nonetheless doesn't throw off new species, and so it's kind of like a lone twig. And here's another similar species. This is another lone twig. Its nearest relatives are related by a common ancestor around about here, but this one does throw off new species. You can see there's failed species thrown off at regular intervals all along the length of that branch, and that kind of suggests that there may be a fitness peak that this species is on, and it would be surrounded by a fitness trough. So although speciation occurs, the offspring species are unsuccessful, and only one species manages to occupy the niche. The niche is too small for other nearby relatives to get a foothold in it, and they're obliterated by the parent species whenever they arise. So that's the concept I'm talking about there, a lone twig. And in addition to stemming the force of natural selection from other species, humans have mostly eliminated their predators or drastically reduced their numbers. So we face reduced competition from other species and reduced predation, a double kick in the teeth to natural selection. Another selective force that operates on most species is pathogens, and we're hard at work at killing most of those off as well. So far we've not found the equivalent of a cordyceps fungus, a pathogen powerful enough to keep us in check, and it seems likely that supplementing our immune systems with the arsenal of modern medicine will help us, or will help keep us much less hampered by parasites than might otherwise be expected of such a numerous and sociable species. Then there's infant death, another huge source of selection on our ancestors, but now drastically reduced in modern times. Other sources of reduced human mortality include the virtualization of male combat and warfare, so human beings play sports with each other rather than fighting each other in the real world. Basically, humans don't like dying prematurely, or that happening to their friends, relatives or offspring, so the human rise to power has resulted in war being declared on the forces that kill people. I find I often face scepticism when talking about the possibility of universal cooperation, a planetary scale organism and the end of natural selection. However, the idea of biological monopolies illustrates that the idea may not be as far out as all that. Our species has already taken many steps to reduce the force of natural selection on it. It is a niche monopolist, and it's obliterated most of its competitors, and so it can now do what it likes, more or less. It's also practically obliterated most of its predators, and it's working on doing the same thing to its parasites. It's having a good bash at eliminating most sources of death and serious illness as well. It's getting rid of male combat, warfare, infant death, and other sources of serious illness. The idea that natural selection will act more weakly on us in the future is a projection of a clearly established existing trend. Another similar perspective arises out of viewing the evolution of cooperative structures in general. Cooperation is one of nature's good tricks. It worked well for ants. Ants represent about 25% of the total terrestrial biomass in the tropics. Similarly, multicellularity worked well for the eukaryotes. Helping your fellows really does pay, and the enormous scale of the human cooperative efforts is a continuation of an existing trend, and what we've seen so far is just the beginning of that. Enjoy.